The glass was still cold from the whiskey when James Dawson gripped it in his hand, the neck of the bottle slick with condensation. The family dinner table should have been a place of celebration, but the tension that night was so thick it clung to every word and gesture. Grace Dawson, 29 years old, sat across from her parents and her older brother Kyle. She had been silent for most of the evening, choosing to listen instead of speak, watching the alcohol flow too freely into Kyle's glass. He had already slurred his words twice, and each time Mary and their mother smoothed it over with a laugh that sounded more like a plea than joy. Grace knew this pattern. Kyle's drinking was the storm cloud that never left their household, and her parents were the endless umbrellas shielding him from the rain, no matter who else drowned. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing at Grace as if her very existence was an inconvenience. Kyle dropped his fork, sending it clattering onto the hardwood floor, and muttered a curse that carried across the dining room. Grace instinctively bent to pick it up, but before she could, Kyle waved her off. "Do not bother," he slurred. "You always make things worse." That was when she spoke up, her voice steadier than she expected. "Kyle needs help, not another glass. He needs rehab." The words hung in the air like smoke. James's face hardened instantly. His hand tightened around the bottle. Marian's fork paused halfway to her lips. Kyle smirked, though his eyes betrayed the panic of someone who had been exposed. "Shut your mouth!" James barked, slamming the base of the bottle onto the table with a heavy thud that rattled the plates. "You do not get to lecture us in this house." Grace's pulse quickened, but she refused to look away. "I am not lecturing," she said, her voice cracking with both fear and conviction. "I am telling the truth. He is drunk. He is out of control. You cannot keep protecting him." James stood towering over her, his shadow stretching across the table. His breath reeked of liquor and resentment. His voice dropped more dangerous in its quiet than any shout could be. "You think you know better than me? You think you get to tell me how to handle my own son?" Grace's chair scraped backward as she instinctively moved away, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. Kyle leaned back in his chair, watching like a spectator at a cruel game, his lips curling in amusement. Marian's eyes darted between her husband and daughter, wide with dread, but when she opened her mouth it was not to defend Grace. "Do not you dare call the cops," she hissed suddenly, as though rehearsing a line she had said before. "Protect Kyle, not her." The bottle came down before Grace could process the betrayal. James swung it sideways, and the glass shattered against her face with a sickening crack. Pain exploded across her cheekbone, sharp shards cutting her skin as blood poured down in hot streams. The sound of breaking glass echoed louder than her own scream. The world tilted violently. Grace staggered, clutching her face, her hand slick with red. The room spun, her vision swimming with stars and shadows. Kyle stood now, but not to help. His expression was cold, detached, almost triumphant. Marian rushed forward, but not toward Grace. She pushed past her bleeding daughter and ran to the window, shouting to the neighbors who might have heard the commotion. She fell. She just tripped. Nothing to worry about. Grace's knees buckled, her body collapsing to the hardwood. She could feel shards of glass digging into her skin as her weight pressed down. Her last sight before the darkness consumed her was her father's face, calm now, almost satisfied, and her mother's frantic hand waving to the outside world, crafting the lie before anyone could ask questions. The room faded. The voices blurred, and as Grace's eyes closed, her final thought was not of rescue, not of comfort, but of erasure. She was bleeding out on the floor of her family's home, and the people meant to love her had chosen to bury her truth in favor of Kyle's freedom. When Grace's eyes opened again, the light above her was blinding, sterile, and unyielding. A steady beep echoed beside her, slow but relentless, reminding her that her heart still fought even when the rest of her body wanted to surrender. Her lips felt cracked, her throat dry, and when she tried to move, a sharp pain shot across her face, searing down her cheekbone and jaw. She reached up slowly, her fingers brushing against rough bandages that stretched tight across her skin. The metallic scent of disinfectant mingled with the faint trace of blood that still clung to her nostrils. Confusion flooded her first, then fear. Then the fragments of memory from the night before clawed their way back. The dinner table. Kyle's smirk, her father's rage, her mother's words, the crash of glass against her face. She swallowed hard, forcing herself upright against the pillows. The room swam for a moment, the edges of her vision blurring, but she refused to sink back down. She needed to know where she was, what had happened, and why she was still breathing when her family had left her bleeding on the floor. The door opened softly, and an older nurse stepped in. Her dark skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, her eyes warm but steady. She smiled gently as she approached, her voice low and kind. "Well, look who is awake at last. My name is Rose Harper. I have been checking on you these past couple of days. You gave everyone a scare." Grace tried to speak, but her throat burned. Rose quickly poured water into a cup and guided the straw to her lips. "Slow now," Rose warned, letting her sip. The water was lukewarm, metallic from the pipes, but to Grace it felt like the purest relief. "How long?" she rasped. Rose hesitated, her kind eyes flickering with something heavier. "3 days, honey. You have been unconscious since the incident." Grace's heart pounded harder. 3 days! She remembered collapsing the world going black, but she had not realized it had stretched into days. "Did anyone come?" she asked, her voice hoarse, fragile. Rose's silence spoke volumes before her words did. "No baby? Not your parents, not your brother. Not once. Just me and the staff here." Grace closed her eyes, but the tears never came. She wanted to feel grief, anger, betrayal, but instead, she felt a hollow ache, a confirmation of what she already suspected deep down. They had left her there. They had chosen Kyle. Rose gently touched her hand, her voice soft but unflinching. "I heard what your mama told the officer that night. She said you had been drinking, that you stumbled, that it was nothing serious. They did not call an ambulance. It was your neighbor who did when they heard the crash." Grace's stomach turned, bile rising, but she forced it back down. "So they lied," she whispered. Rose nodded slowly. "They lied to protect him." Grace's chest tightened. Images rushed through her mind. James towering over her. Marion's frantic lie to the neighbors. Kyle's detached stare. Every piece fit too neatly into a picture she did not want to believe but could no longer deny. They had erased her. They had scrubbed her out of their version of events before her blood had even dried on the floorboards. Rose squeezed her hand gently. Some families do not deserve the children they are given. Grace turned her face toward the window, the blinds half open, showing the world still turning outside, while her own had been shattered. A nurse's station phone rang in the distance, a reminder that life continued, even as hers had stalled. For the first time, she wondered if her survival had been a mistake, a crack in the script her family had written to bury her. But as she lay there bandaged and broken, another thought clawed its way through the haze. If they had gone so far to erase her, what else had they hidden, and how many lies had they built to keep Kyle safe? Grace had always been the quiet one, the dependable one, the daughter who never asked for more than the bare minimum. While other kids at school demanded expensive shoes or begged their parents for rides to concerts, she buried herself in textbooks and after-school jobs, convinced that if she worked hard enough she could buy herself a way out of the Dawson house. From the outside, the Dawson family looked picture-perfect, with James projecting the image of a strong provider, Marion smiling politely at church socials, and Kyle standing tall as the so-called golden boy, the son destined to carry on the family pride. Inside those walls, however, the truth was suffocating. Kyle had been drinking since high school, sneaking beers from the garage fridge, showing up late to class with bloodshot eyes. But every time he was caught, James stepped in with a booming voice, intimidating teachers and principals alike, until the issue disappeared. Marion polished Kyle's tarnished image with excuses, whispering about stress, about boys being boys, about how he just needed more time to grow up. Meanwhile, Grace faded into the wallpaper, her achievements brushed aside like dust. When she graduated high school with honors, James barely attended the ceremony, spending most of his time on his phone. When she got into the University of Georgia with a scholarship, Marion smiled but quickly changed the subject to Kyle's new business idea, even though everyone knew it was doomed to fail. Grace studied pharmaceutical sciences, clawing her way through sleepless nights and endless labs, determined to create a life where she did not have to beg for scraps of acknowledgement. She graduated at 26 with honors, working 2 part-time jobs to keep herself afloat. But when she brought her diploma home, James set it on the mantel without comment, replacing the pride she had longed for with silence. Kyle, on the other hand, had been bailed out of jail twice by then for drunk and disorderly conduct. Each time, James and Marian closed ranks around him, insisting to neighbors and friends that it was just a misunderstanding, a case of wrong place and wrong time. Grace's resentment grew like a shadow she could not escape, but she kept it buried, convinced that once she landed a real job and moved away, none of it would matter anymore. Then the call came that changed everything. A pharmaceutical company in New York City had offered her a position. It was the kind of opportunity she had worked for since she was a teenager, a ticket out of the suffocating Dawson orbit. That evening, she sat at the family dinner table, her hands trembling with excitement as she prepared to share the news. James dominated the table conversation as always, bragging about Kyle's latest attempt to start a contracting business, praising his son's so-called grit and determination, ignoring the way Kyle had already drained their savings with unpaid debts. Grace finally interrupted her voice, soft but steady. "I have an offer in New York, a real job. I am moving next month." The silence that followed was not the silence of awe or pride. It was heavy disapproving, suffused with the weight of their disdain. James's brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We need you here," he said flatly. "Family first. Your brother needs us." Marian added quickly, her voice saccharine. "You cannot just abandon Kyle, Grace. He is struggling. We are a family, and family means sticking together." Grace wanted to scream that she had been abandoned long ago, that she had been invisible in this house for years, but the words lodged in her throat. Kyle smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Good luck in the big city," he muttered, his tone dripping with mockery. Grace's chest burned with frustration, but she swallowed it down the way she always had. That night, alone in her room, she stared at her packed bags, the acceptance letter glowing on her laptop screen. She told herself it would not matter what they thought. She would leave start fresh and finally build a life that was hers alone. But even in that moment of victory, she felt the gnawing ache of knowing she would never be enough for them, no matter how far she went or how high she climbed. That ache would soon turn into something much darker, something she could never have predicted when the bottle shattered across her face and the fragile picture she had clung to collapsed for good. The night of the incident had begun with the same patterns Grace had grown to hate. Kyle stumbled into the dining room, already flushed with liquor, his tie hanging loose, his eyes glassy with that familiar, reckless glow. James greeted him with a booming laugh, clapping him on the shoulder as if his son's drunken state was a badge of honor. Marian fluttered nervously around the table, setting down bowls of mashed potatoes and roasted chicken as though food could disguise the storm brewing within the walls. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her lips pressed together, watching the charade unfold. She had promised herself she would not say anything, not tonight, not when she was so close to leaving for New York. But the words pressed against her throat like stones impossible to keep down. Kyle reached for another glass, his hand unsteady, spilling amber liquid across the tablecloth. James chuckled, waving it off, but Grace could not stay silent. "That is enough, Kyle," she said sharply. "You are already drunk." Her words sliced through the room like a knife. James's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing with fury. Kyle smirked, leaning back in his chair, mocking her with a slow clap. "Look who thinks she is better than us," he sneered. The air thickened with tension, and Marian's hand trembled as she reached for her fork. "Do not start this now, Grace," she pleaded. But Grace could not stop. "He needs rehab. He is destroying himself, and you are all letting him. For once, just admit it." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the ceiling fan above. James's face darkened, his jaw tightening until the veins in his neck stood out. "Shut your mouth," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You do not get to speak about your brother that way." Grace's chest heaved, but she met his glare with one of her own. "Someone has to tell the truth." If you keep covering for him, he will kill himself, or worse, someone else. That was the moment James snapped. In a blur of movement, he rose from his chair, snatching the whiskey bottle by its neck. Before Grace could move, before Marion could gasp, James swung the bottle in a vicious arc. The glass shattered against her face with a horrifying crack, shards exploding outward, embedding in her skin. Pain erupted like fire across her cheek, hot blood streaming down her neck. Grace screamed, the sound strangled and raw, echoing off the walls. She staggered backward, her hands clutching at her face, feeling the jagged edges of broken glass cutting deeper as she tried to pull them free. The taste of iron filled her mouth and the room spun violently. Marion shot up from her chair, but not toward her daughter. She darted to the window, shoving it open, shouting desperately to the neighbors who had surely heard the commotion. She fell. Marion cried, her voice shrill and rehearsed. She just tripped, nothing to worry about. Kyle stood slowly, his expression chillingly detached, his lips curling in amusement as he watched his sister collapse. Grace's knees buckled her body, slamming onto the hardwood floor. Shards of glass dug into her palms and arms as she braced herself, her blood staining the polished wood beneath her. The room blurred, the sound of her own breathing ragged and desperate. She looked up, her vision fractured, catching the sight of her father's face. He was calm now, almost satisfied, as though he had finally put her in her place. Marion's voice rose higher, pleading with invisible witnesses outside, spinning lies with practiced ease. "Do not call anyone. She is fine. Just clumsy, always has been." Grace tried to speak, tried to scream that it was not true, but her mouth filled with blood, the words lost in a gurgle of pain. Kyle's gaze met hers briefly, and in that split second she saw nothing. No guilt, no remorse, only cold indifference. He turned away, adjusting his jacket as if preparing to leave. Grace's body trembled violently, her vision tunneling. Her last thought before the darkness swallowed her was not of anger, not even of fear, but of erasure. In their eyes, she had already ceased to exist, her suffering nothing more than an inconvenience to be hidden. The world went black, the voices around her fading into silence, and Grace slipped under, buried alive by the betrayal of her own blood. When Grace drifted back into consciousness, the world felt muted, as though she were underwater, and every sound was muffled, every image blurred. The hospital lights above her were hazy halos that burned into her eyes, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside her became the only anchor tying her to reality. Her face throbbed with relentless pain, each pulse of her heart sending fire down the side of her cheek and into her jaw. She tried to shift, but a sharp sting shot through her ribs, forcing her to gasp in shallow breaths. Memories clawed their way back piece by piece, and with them came the crushing weight of betrayal. The bottle, the scream, the crash of glass, her father's face calm in its fury, her mother's frantic voice calling out to the neighbors, not in concern for her bleeding daughter, but in desperation to protect Kyle. Grace swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of blood that still lingered at the back of her throat. She closed her eyes, hoping that maybe when she opened them, she would see her parents at her side. Remorseful, shaken, perhaps finally realizing the depth of the damage they had caused. Instead, when she turned her head, she saw only the sterile emptiness of the room and the worn figure of Rose Harper sitting in a chair by her bed. Her eyes kind but heavy with truths she seemed reluctant to share. Grace's voice cracked as she whispered, "Did they come?" Rose shook her head slowly, her lips pressed into a line. "No, baby, not once. Just me and the nurses." Grace's chest tightened until she thought her ribs might snap again. The hollowness inside her grew wider, darker, confirming what she had always suspected, but never dared to face head-on. She was not just unloved, she was disposable. Rose hesitated before speaking again, her voice quieter as though the walls themselves might betray her. "I heard your mama talking to the officer that night. She told him there was no assault, that you had been drinking, that you slipped and fell. She said it was nothing to worry about." Grace's stomach twisted violently, her body trembling as she forced herself to listen. "And your father?" Rose continued. He agreed. They both insisted there was no need for charges, no need for an ambulance. If it had not been for your neighbor who called when they heard the crash, you might not have made it here at all." The words sliced through Grace sharper than the glass had. Her own parents had not only struck her down, but had erased the truth rewriting the story before her blood had even dried. She clenched her fists against the sheets, the pain of the stitches pulling, but unable to outweigh the searing ache in her chest. "So they lied," she whispered more to herself than to Rose. "They lied to protect him." Rose nodded slowly, her gaze steady, her hand reaching out to rest gently on Grace's trembling fingers. "Some families," she said softly, "do not deserve the children they are given." Grace turned her face toward the ceiling, tears burning but refusing to fall. She thought of all the years she had tried to be good enough, the late nights studying, the jobs she had worked, the sacrifices she had made, all for even a scrap of recognition. And yet here she was, broken and bandaged, discarded like trash, while Kyle sat at home, shielded by the lies of their parents. The monitors beeped steadily beside her marking time in a world that had turned cruelly indifferent. Grace wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the truth was already clear. They had made their choice. They had chosen Kyle. They had chosen the son who destroyed everything he touched over the daughter who had given them nothing but loyalty. Grace lay there, her body trembling with rage and sorrow, but beneath it all a spark began to glow. If they thought she would disappear quietly, they were wrong. If they thought their lies would bury her, they did not know the strength of the very daughter they tried to erase. For the first time, Grace did not feel powerless. She felt awakened, aware of the betrayal in its full, raw truth, and with it came the first threads of resolve. Grace spent the following days trapped in a cycle of pain and silence, her face swollen, her ribs aching with every shallow breath, yet her mind racing far faster than her body could handle. Nurses came and went with their charts and clipped voices checking vitals, adjusting machines, but none of them lingered long enough to notice the storm behind her eyes. Only Rose Harper stayed, the older nurse whose presence carried the calm of someone who had seen too many lives shattered and too few put back together. Rose spoke to her not as a patient, but as a person, her words carrying warmth that Grace had never received from her own mother. "Sometimes God leaves a witness," Rose told her one afternoon as she adjusted the blankets. Grace turned her head toward her, her voice still raspy. "Why me? Why now?" Rose's eyes softened as she sat down beside the bed. "Because they thought you would not survive. Because they thought you would vanish and no one would ask questions. But I saw you. I sat here when no one else did. That makes me a witness, and sometimes that is enough to change everything." Grace closed her eyes, the weight of those words pressing into her chest. A witness. Someone who could confirm what had happened when her own family was busy spinning lies. The thought planted itself deep inside her, fragile but stubborn, like a seed breaking through concrete. She began to ask questions, quiet at first, then sharper, demanding to know who had been contacted, what had been recorded, what her parents had said. Rose did not hide the truth. No visitors, no calls, only a file that claimed she had slipped and fallen. Grace's fists clenched beneath the sheets, the pain of her stitches screaming in protest. She could not let this stand. She could not let their version of the story become the only one that survived. That night, as the ward quieted and the halls dimmed, Grace asked Rose for paper and a pen. Her fingers trembled as she wrote, but she forced the words out, line after line, documenting everything she remembered, every detail of that night, every word, every look, every lie. If her family wanted to erase her, she would leave behind a record they could not scrub away. It was then that Rose leaned closer, her voice low. "You need more than notes, Grace. You need someone who knows the law. Someone who can protect you when the lies start to unravel." Grace's heart pounded, her fear clashing with a sudden surge of hope. She had never imagined fighting back. She had only imagined running away. But maybe fighting was the only way left. "Do you know someone?" she whispered. Rose nodded. "Melissa Grant, civil rights attorney. Tough as nails. She does not back down when things get ugly. I can make a call." Grace hesitated, the image of her father's fury and her mother's cold voice flashing in her mind. But then she remembered the bottle, the blood, the silence after. Do it, she said quietly. Rose squeezed her hand and gave a small nod. The next morning, Melissa Grant walked into the hospital room, her presence filling the space with authority. She was tall, sharp-eyed, her voice crisp but not unkind. She introduced herself, asked questions with precision, listened without interruption. Grace told her everything, her voice breaking at times but never faltering completely. When she finished, Melissa leaned back, her expression grave. This is not just assault, Grace. This is a cover-up. This is obstruction. This is fraud. And if you are willing, we can fight this. Grace felt a tremor of fear, but also the first spark of power. For the first time in her life, someone was not asking her to stay quiet. Someone was asking if she was ready to speak. Grace's recovery was slow, every movement pulling at the stitches in her cheek and sending jolts of pain through her ribs, but her mind sharpened with each passing day. Pain became fuel, a constant reminder of why she could not let the story end the way her parents wanted it to. Melissa visited again 2 days later, bringing with her a thin laptop and a voice recorder. "We need evidence," she said simply. "Your word is strong, but against theirs it is not enough." Grace nodded, the weight of that truth heavy on her chest. She began with her phone, which Rose had rescued from her belongings, and charged. Her hands shook as she opened it, scrolling through the remnants of her life. She searched for the family group chat she had once been part of, a digital space where Marion sent daily reminders about church potlucks, and James posted pictures of Kyle fixing cars or holding up a glass of bourbon. But it was gone. Confused, Grace scrolled deeper until she found something chilling. A new group had been created titled Dawson 3. She remembered clearly that it had once been Dawson 4 with her included. Now her name and number were erased as though she had never been there. Her breath caught in her throat as she handed the phone to Melissa. "They deleted me," she whispered. Melissa's eyes darkened as she scrolled. "That is deliberate exclusion. It shows intent to remove you from the narrative." Screenshots, Grace. Save everything. Grace tapped quickly, capturing the images, saving them in a hidden folder. The anger rising inside her was almost stronger than the pain in her body. They had not only hurt her, but also rewritten the family story without her. It was digital proof of betrayal. Days later, Rose entered the room with an envelope tucked discreetly under her arm. "A neighbor dropped this off," she murmured. "Said it might matter to you." Grace opened it with trembling hands and pulled out a small recorder. She pressed play, and Marion's voice spilled into the room, sharp and hurried. "Protect Kyle," she insisted. "She will heal." "It is nothing." James's voice followed, low and commanding. "Do not let anyone call the cops. This never happened." Grace's chest tightened as the recording ended. She handed it to Melissa, whose eyes gleamed with grim satisfaction. "This is obstruction of justice, clear as day." Grace felt sick but vindicated. The lies were no longer shadows whispered behind closed doors. They were tangible, caught on tape. But Melissa wanted more. "Insurance records," she said. "They will have filed something. People like your father always try to cover every angle." Grace remembered the endless stacks of paperwork James kept locked in his office. Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. If they claimed she had not been hurt, it would be written down somewhere. That night, she borrowed Rose's tablet and logged into the insurance portal with her mother's old password, one she had memorized years ago when helping Marion reset her email. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the claims. There it was, a document filed within 24 hours of the assault. The claim described the incident as minor property damage, no injuries reported, all occupants safe. And there, scrawled across the bottom, was James's signature. Grace covered her mouth, her body shaking with rage and disbelief. He had signed away her existence for money. She forwarded the file to Melissa immediately. The attorney's reply came within the hour. "This is gold. This shows deliberate fraud." Grace sank back into her pillows, her body aching, but her spirit sharper than it had ever been. The pieces were coming together. One evening, as the sun dipped low outside the hospital window, Rose sat with her reading quietly from a psalm. Grace listened, but her mind drifted back to the moment her father's hand swung the bottle. The betrayal burned hotter now than the wound itself, but alongside the pain came something new: determination. Every screenshot, every recording, every fraudulent document was another brick in the case. She was building a wall of truth too solid for even James to tear down. Still, she knew she needed to prepare for the storm that would follow. Families like hers did not surrender quietly. They would fight, they would lie, they would claw to protect Kyle the golden son. But Grace was no longer the quiet daughter who faded into the wallpaper. She was becoming someone else, someone who could stand against them. That night, as she lay awake listening to the hum of machines, Grace began sketching out a timeline in her notebook. She listed every event in brutal detail: the dinner, the confrontation, the swing of the bottle, the lies Marion screamed to the neighbors, the erasure from the family chat, the fraudulent insurance claim. She wrote down names: Rose the neighbor, the attending physician, every nurse who had witnessed her injuries. Each detail sharpened her resolve. By the time the dawn broke and light spilled across the sterile hospital floor, Grace was no longer simply recovering. She was preparing for battle. She knew what they had done, and she would not let it remain hidden. Grace left the hospital 3 weeks later with a brace strapped tight around her ribs and stitches still pulling at the edge of her cheek. The mirror reflected a face she barely recognized, swollen and scarred, but behind the bruises her eyes burned with something new, a sharpness that had never been there before. Rose wheeled her out to the waiting car, where Melissa stood briefcase in hand, her expression a mix of professionalism and quiet encouragement. They drove in silence until they reached Melissa's office, a modest brick building tucked between a pharmacy and a coffee shop. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, and the walls were lined with case files. Melissa spread Grace's evidence across the desk: the screenshots of the Dawson 3 chat, the audio recording of Marion's desperate cover-up, the fraudulent insurance claim bearing James's signature. "This is strong," Melissa said firmly, "but before we move forward, you need to be ready for what comes next." Grace swallowed, her voice steady. "I am ready. For once in my life, I will not be silenced." That night, Grace sat alone in her small apartment, the shadows deep and the silence heavy. Her phone lay on the table screen, glowing faintly, Marion's number highlighted. Her fingers hovered over the call button, her breath shallow. She knew what she had to do. She pressed it, the line ringing twice before Marion's voice answered, cool and composed. "Hello?" Grace's voice was calm, even though her body trembled. "I know what you did. The lies to the police, the insurance fraud, deleting me from the family chat. I know all of it." Silence stretched on the line, and then Marion's tone sharpened. "You always needed saving, Grace. You were always weak. Kyle is the future. He deserves protection. You are nothing but trouble." Grace's chest tightened, but she did not falter. "You chose him over me, and now you will face the truth. See you in court." Before Marion could reply, Grace hung up. She stared at the phone, her heart racing, but she felt no regret. For the first time, she had spoken not as a victim, but as someone reclaiming her place in the story. The next morning, Melissa filed the initial complaint, and news spread quickly through their small Georgia town. Rumors rippled across church pews and grocery store aisles. Whispers grew louder with each passing day. Grace did not hide. She walked through town, her face marked by scars, her ribs aching but her shoulders straight. People stared, some with sympathy, others with suspicion, but she did not lower her gaze. When she returned home that evening, she found an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in red ink. "Keep your mouth shut." Grace's hands shook, but she only smiled grimly. Fear was their weapon, and she would not let it cut her down again. She photographed the note and handed it to Melissa the next day. "They are rattled," Melissa said. "That means we are getting closer." Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. A week later, she stood outside the courthouse for a preliminary hearing. James and Marion arrived together. James's jaw tight. Marion dressed in a black suit and pearls, her expression carefully crafted into sorrow. Kyle trailed behind his skin, pale, his hands twitching as though he craved the drink he had been denied by court order. Grace stepped inside her cane, tapping against the marble floor, each click echoing through the halls. Reporters turned their heads, cameras flashing, questions flying, but she kept walking, her chin high. Inside, the judge reviewed the initial filings, his brows furrowed as Melissa presented the evidence. When Grace was asked if she had anything to say, she stood slowly, the entire room watching. "My name is Grace Dawson," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. I was not drunk. I did not fall. My father smashed a bottle against my face, and my mother lied to protect my brother. They tried to erase me, but I am still here." Murmurs rippled across the courtroom. James glared at her, his fists clenched. Marion's face remained a mask of control, though her eyes flickered with something Grace had never seen before: fear. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet her gaze. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable, and called for the session to continue another day. Grace walked out of the courthouse surrounded by flashing cameras and shouting voices, but inside she felt a strange calm. The confrontation had happened, and she had not broken. That evening, she sat in her apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. Her body sore, but her spirit unyielding. She thought of her mother's words, the venom in them, and realized that they no longer had power over her. She had spoken the truth aloud in front of the world, and the truth was now a blade sharper than any bottle. She knew the battle ahead would be long, filled with more lies, more attempts to silence her, but she also knew she was not alone. Rose stood beside her, Melissa fought for her, and the evidence was on her side. For the first time in her life, Grace believed she could win. The courthouse in Savannah loomed large and unyielding when Grace arrived for the criminal trial. She wore a plain navy blouse, her hair tied back neatly, her scar visible against her pale skin. She refused to hide it. The scar was proof of what had been done to her, and she would not let shame cover it. Melissa walked beside her, exuding quiet authority, her briefcase heavy with evidence. Rose sat in the gallery, her hands folded around a small prayer book, her eyes never leaving Grace. James sat at the defense table, his jaw locked, his shoulders stiff in a suit that did not soften the rage burning in his eyes. Marion sat beside him, dressed in mourning black, as if she were attending a funeral, her pearls gleaming like cold armor. Kyle shifted nervously, his face pale, his eyes darting to the bailiff as if searching for escape. The prosecution presented the case first, calling Rose to the stand. Her voice was steady as she recounted the night she found Grace unconscious, broken, and abandoned. She told the court how Marion had lied to the police, how she alone had stayed by Grace's side when no family came. The neighbor testified next, their voice shaking as they played the recording of Marion's words. "Protect Kyle. She will heal. Do not call the cops." The courtroom gasped, whispers filling the air. Then the forensic doctor explained the nature of Grace's wounds. The lacerations, the pattern of glass embedded in her skin, the fractures to her ribs. No way this was a fall, the doctor concluded. This was a deliberate blow with a bottle. James shifted uncomfortably, his mask beginning to crack. Grace sat quietly, her cane resting beside her, her eyes never leaving her parents. When the defense tried to paint her as unstable, Melissa rose sharply, dismantling their arguments with precision, pointing again and again to the evidence: the fraudulent insurance claim, the deleted group chat, the witnesses who had nothing to gain. Finally, Grace was called to the stand. She stood slowly, gripping her cane, and faced the jury. "My name is Grace Dawson," she said firmly. "I am not clumsy. I was not drunk. I did not fall. My father smashed a bottle into my face. My mother lied to protect my brother. They tried to erase me. They failed." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on every soul present. The jury deliberated for hours but returned with a verdict that felt like air rushing back into Grace's lungs. James Dawson was found guilty of assault and battery, sentenced to 5 years in prison. Marion was found guilty of obstruction of justice and perjury, receiving 2 years suspended sentence and heavy fines. Kyle was ordered into court, mandated rehabilitation for alcohol abuse, and his DUI charges placed permanently on his record. Grace sat motionless as the sentences were read, but inside a tide of emotion surged, a mixture of relief, grief, and vindication. Yet Melissa leaned close and whispered, "This is only half the battle. Next is civil court." Days later, the civil trial began. This time, Grace was the plaintiff suing her parents for damages, emotional harm, and insurance fraud. The courtroom felt different, less about guilt, and more about truth and restitution. Melissa laid out the timeline like a story, showing the jury the progression of betrayal. Grace being erased from the family chat, the insurance document signed by James, the audio of Marion's cover-up, the photographs of Grace's wounds. Every piece of evidence was a puzzle forming the picture of a daughter deliberately abandoned and erased. Grace testified again this time not about the night of violence, but about the years of invisibility. The countless times she was pushed aside for Kyle, the way her achievements were ignored while her brother's failures were celebrated. She spoke of the moment she realized she was not just neglected, but expendable. Her voice shook, but she did not break. The defense tried to argue that the family had been under stress, that it was a tragic misunderstanding, but Melissa cut through their words like a blade. This was not stress, she thundered. This was a deliberate choice to erase a daughter for the sake of a drunk son. This was cruelty, fraud, and willful emotional harm. The jury agreed. They awarded Grace $950,000 in damages, citing both emotional harm and fraud. James and Marion sat frozen, their empire of lies crumbling before them. Kyle slumped his head in his hands, the weight of exposure finally sinking in. Grace listened as the judge spoke, but she felt strangely calm. The money was not what mattered. What mattered was that the truth was written into the record, official and undeniable. Her parents had tried to erase her, but the law had carved her name back into stone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed their microphones, thrust forward, their voices clamoring for quotes. Grace did not stop. She walked down the steps with Melissa on one side and Rose on the other, her cane tapping softly against the concrete. Marion's voice cracked behind her, calling out, "We loved you, Grace." Grace turned her eyes steady, her voice cool. "Then maybe you should have acted like it." She faced forward again and kept walking, the cameras flashing like lightning around her. That night, alone in her apartment, Grace sat by the window and let the silence settle. The trials were over, but the scars remained. She touched the line on her cheek, not with shame, but with recognition. It was the mark of survival of truth that could not be erased. She thought of her father behind bars, her mother bound by probation, her brother forced into treatment. Justice had not erased the past, but it had drawn a line through the lies. For the first time in her life, Grace felt free. A year after the trials, the summer heat of Savannah pressed down heavy on the streets, but inside the small corner cafe that Grace had opened, the air was cool and filled with the comforting smell of fresh cinnamon rolls and coffee beans. She named it Second Dawn because that was what her life felt like, a sunrise after the longest and darkest night. The place was simple, mismatched tables and a bulletin board where people could pin notes, but it carried something more powerful than design. It carried presence, a quiet kind of sanctuary where no one asked what had happened to you, but everyone understood. Grace moved slowly still. Her ribs ached on damp days, and the scar across her cheek glistened under the morning light, but she no longer tried to hide them. Each limp of her walk was a reminder that she had survived, that she had stood when no one expected her to. Rose came every Sunday carrying her well-worn prayer book, sitting in the corner booth, where sometimes 3 people joined her, sometimes 10. They did not preach, they did not demand, they simply read and listened, creating a space of quiet companionship. Melissa stopped by often, too, her sharp suits traded for casual clothes, her laugh easier now that the case was behind them. She and Grace shared coffee, sometimes silence, sometimes stories of other battles fought and won. One afternoon, a 17-year-old girl with nervous eyes and a streak of blue in her hair came in asking for work. No resume, no references. Just a look in her eyes that Grace recognized instantly, the look of someone who had been forced to rebuild from ash. Grace hired her on the spot. "Everyone deserves a chance," she told her, remembering the words Rose had spoken in that hospital room. Grace kept a jar on the counter labeled, "Help Survivors Start Again," and every day people dropped in coins and bills, small gestures that built something larger. One morning, Kevin Harper, the delivery driver who had once helped her, walked in wearing his usual faded jacket. Grace hugged him tight, the kind of hug that said, "Thank you for saving my life." He chuckled and said she did not owe him anything. "You stayed alive," he told her, and that was enough. Later that week, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a postcard of a mountain with blocky handwriting across the back. "You gave me courage to come back." It read, signed only Nico. Grace pinned it to the board by the door, a reminder that her fight had reached farther than she could have imagined. One evening after closing, Grace carried a small tin can to the alley behind the cafe. Inside were letters she had written months earlier, Letters to James, to Marion, even to Kyle. Words of pain and rage she had never mailed because they were not for them, they were for her. One by one, she struck a match and dropped the letters into the can, watching the edges curl and blacken until they turned to smoke. Closure is not always conversation, she whispered to herself. Sometimes it is silence. The next morning, as she wiped down the outdoor tables, she overheard a couple reading the gold lettering on her cafe window. "We are family when others walk away." The woman tilted her head and said softly, "That is beautiful." Her husband nodded. "It is more than beautiful, it is true." Grace smiled quietly, the sun warming her shoulders. They had taken her blood, her trust, her time, but they had not taken her fire. They thought they had erased her, but they had only planted a seed. And this, she thought as she stepped back inside, to greet the day, this is what grew.